Stay awake and be prepared. Once again, we hear words of warning with apocalyptic overtones, those foreboding words of a place where there is wailing and grinding of teeth. Yes, last week we reflected on the different responses to God's invitation to the kingdom, the generous and inclusive invitation to join in God's kingdom, as represented through the parable of the wedding banquet. And we encountered many who, though invited, were ultimately not drawn into God's reign. Some who ignored the invitation, some who were preoccupied or distracted and apathetic, some who violently resisted, and this last one, who was presumptuous and unprepared. And today's gospel parable conveys a similar message, but in reverse. It's not that God is offering and inviting, but God is coming to us. So get ready. Be prepared, because otherwise, presumption and unpreparedness merit punishment, and will elicit in us the regretful sentiment, if only I had known. Well, no excuses, because you do know. Jesus is calling you out. Wake up. And there's an earnestness, an exigency here in Jesus' words, for you know not the hour when the Lord will come, be it in the end of times themselves or at the hour of our own death. Hindsight is always 20/20, as they say, to look back on having been unprepared and wishing that we could change or undo the past. But we are being stirred to action and awareness now. Because as Jesus says, now is the proper time to set things right. We have each been richly blessed by God, and such gifts ought to be put into proper service, rightly channeled for the glory of God and for the love and care of our fellow pilgrims on the journey. Yes, as we hear in the gospel, God is a generous giver, entrusting generous gifts to each of us, and those who cultivate their gifts and blessings in such loving service will find that they increase. Blessed is that servant whom the master will later put in charge of all his property, sharing generously in all that he has. But not so for the wicked servant, though. For if such gifts are misused and turned inwardly, selfishly, we hear of harsh condemnation and punishment. These gifts are not meant for self-aggrandizement, excessive self-concern with personal comforts, seeking personal advantage at others' expense, or the disparagement and harm of others, as we find with the wicked servant. No, even though we're all richly blessed in the here and now, we have many gifts for which to be grateful. Jesus is calling us to be prepared, to stay awake, to be alert, to know that God is coming, and that we ought to be found using these gifts in proper order for love and service. Keep death always before your eyes, as the order of St. Benedict commends to us, not out of some excessively morbid outlook, but that we might live in a manner that is worthy of the call we have received, to be a joyful and generous and cheerful giver, a child of God who loves and who lives in a way that is ready to meet the Lord when he comes. We can make it a practice each day to prepare ourselves more and more fully. And I don't just mean staying awake or being prepared for the end times. Too much of apocalyptic dread can be a downer. But rather, we can prepare ourselves by opening up to God's presence and joy in our daily lives, by growing in awareness of God around us in each and every day, in ordinary moments, even in the mundane. It's a bit more of an uplifting take and an invitation to a fullness of life in that call to stay awake, to be prepared, to be alert. Be attentive to where God is in our lives, here and now. One of the great graces of my ministry when I was in Massachusetts was to direct retreatants in the spiritual exercises in everyday life, an adaptation of the 30-day retreat of St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises, but spaced out over the course of many months. Everyday life became food for the prayer that these retreatants would make, being able to recognize the movements of God, God's call, grace, and blessings within their lives as they made the exercises, and yet were also living as contemplatives in action in the world. We also have in our Ignatian spiritual tradition the great gift of the examen prayer, which allows us to pray each day for 10-15 minutes to grow in awareness and, above all, of gratitude for God's gifts. Stay awake and wake up to these epiphanies of God in the everyday. Where might that be? In extraordinary moments, true, to reflect upon major life events and celebrations and occasions, but we shouldn't just look for God there. Look for God in the ordinary, in the mundane, in the everyday, and you'd be surprised at how much gratitude and overflowing joy we'll find for God's blessings. Gratitude for the food that we have to eat, that meal shared with colleagues, the opportunity to laugh with loved ones, to share in friendship and joy, or even a simple word of encouragement from a classmate or a teacher. How do all of these invite us to see God at work within our lives, the blessings that God has given us, and God's love all around us? And yes, perhaps even in harder moments, witnessing the love of family in the midst of personal struggle or loss, the care given in times of grief and tragedy, the way a community responds generously to those in need. These are all manifestations, these little epiphanies in the everyday by which God's grace is given. So yes, by all means, be prepared and stay awake, for we know neither the day nor the hour when the Lord will come. But let's not let it all become about the end times and the moment of death, because we can wake up now, ever more fully to a life abundant. We can be alert to encounter God more fully in the everyday, to realize that He has been there all along, waiting for us, showering us with love, and generously bestowing His many blessings. Wake up and be prepared. God is waiting.